Welcome to the channel, everybody. Today I want to talk about why I think The Conjuring from 2013 does such a good job taking such a simple premise and just executing the hell out of it. So this was actually a first watch for me, surprisingly, and normally this whole demonic possession subgenre in horror is not really something I gravitate towards all that much, but I actually found myself enjoying this movie quite a bit. Is it flawless? Is it a masterpiece in my eyes as just being a person who's kind of lukewarm on this subgenre? No, I wouldn't say so, but there's definitely some things to like here. And I do think they take like such a simple premise and do a really damn good job executing that premise. And we'll talk all about that in just a second. But, so this movie, of course, kicks off the Conjuring universe, which is now up to 8 movies at this point. 3 Conjuring movies, 3 Annabelle movies, and the 2 Nun movies, right? So, which is actually, the Conjuring whole franchise world, I guess you could say, is actually the highest grossing horror franchise ever. It's up to 2.1 billion. Yeah, so I'll also put up on the screen here a little timeline too, if you're interested in kind of seeing where all of the 8 movies take place, kind of where they're set and what era they're set. And I'll put that up on the screen here so you can see that if you're interested in that kind of thing. But yeah, if you're not really familiar with The Conjuring, the concept around The Conjuring, basically we follow Ed and Lorraine. They're these paranormal investigators or demonologists who now have this new job to help this family that moved into this farmhouse in Rhode Island and are essentially terrorized by the old owner of this property, right? Which was a witch that sacrificed her week-old baby to the devil and then killed herself and essentially cursing anyone who takes her land. So sounds like a simple premise, right? Something we've probably seen before. This movie has some inspiration definitely from the Amityville Horror. There's some things in here that will remind you of that. And there's just some things with that concept in this movie just in general that is going to remind you of a lot of just generic demonic possession movies, the dozens, maybe hundreds of them that we've seen, in the genre over the years. But there's a lot to unpack here. So I'm excited to talk about it. And one thing right off the bat is you'll notice after watching this movie that it's actually rated R. And a part of you might walk away from watching this movie and be a little bit surprised by that because there's no sex, there's no nudity, there's no drug use, there's no extreme violence for the most part. This movie is rated R just simply based on the fact of the ratings board just basically was like, this movie is fucking scary enough to be rated R. We need to try to keep some 13-year-olds away from this movie because it's scary. So that's kind of interesting. And there's definitely some stuff here I do think is pretty creepy and has, definitely scary in a lot of ways, especially you can kind of consider the backstory with a lot of things. It's also based on a real life story about this family. Their name's called the Perron family and who moved into the whole famous Conjuring house that maybe you've seen on YouTube. People doing their own ghost investigations of the house, but that's the story. It's based on kind of a real story from 1971 where this family was experiencing these paranormal activities in this house, right? So I will say right off the bat, I do enjoy this era for a horror movie, just right off the bat, especially when it's done well. This late 60s, early 70s, in the early stages of the movie, we're in the late 60s, and then most of the movie takes place in 1971. I love that era for horror. It's just the colors, the kind of our society at that time teetering on this, we're discovering getting these kind of big breakthroughs in technology, but a lot of society is still kind of in the older ways, which is interesting to me. And society is also just dealing with not only the madness of the 70s disco era, but also just the hangover from how crazy the 60s was. And I mean, all of us have grown up hearing stories about also some of the crazy murders and just weird, whether it's paranormal or not, just crazy stuff that happened in the 60s and the 70s. So this era for me is one that I enjoy. It's just something that has a lot of charm for me. There's also a lot of charm in this movie specifically with just when you're watching it, for me, the equipment that they're using to kind of try to capture this paranormal activity, these ghosts and whatnot. I dig it. The old equipment, the old microphones, the old cameras, that stuff has a lot of charm to me and I enjoy it. So This movie is directed by James Wan. You probably know James Wan from the Saw franchise. You know, he helped essentially start the Saw franchise, directed the original Saw movie, and directs this movie as well. And crazy, just like Saw, this guy just once again turns a piece of coal into a fucking diamond. This movie was made for $20 million and ended up making $319 million. Just crazy. I mean, nuts. So when you're kind of introduced to this family right off the bat, you already know, like, when you meet the family dog and the family dog is starting to notice some stuff, you're like, all right, some shit's about to go down. And you know right off the bat, you're like, oh man, this poor little puppers, he is in for no good. You know what I mean? Poor little fella, you know, right off the bat. Also, right off the bat, when a little girl finds a music box, you know you're fucked. You know what I'm saying? Like, that is never a good sign. Move, burn down the house, go as fast as you can right away. If you're ever in a house, especially an old one, and you find an old music box, your little daughter does maybe, cracks that open, run right away. You know that. But one thing I do enjoy, I mean, especially just being a parent myself, I've got 2 kids, not as many kids as they have in this movie, but they do a good job, James Wan does, portraying the parents balancing the stress of life. You see some things with the dad's work. He's kind of having a hard time with that. They got this house, you know, pretty standard for a great deal, right? It was like an auction from the bank. But the parents balancing the stresses of adulthood, which then makes it believable that they overlook a lot of the red flags that are happening just because you're so damn stressed and probably exhausted. So I enjoy that. I think they do an effective job showing that in this movie. Also, you know, they play that little clap game, the little hide and go seek clap game in the movie, which I've never actually seen before. Maybe that's weird. I mean, I always grew up playing like Marco Polo and normal tag and normal hide and go seek and stuff like that. I'm actually going to try that game with my kids. It's kind of like a out of the pool version of Marco Polo. So we're going to try that. I'll let you guys know how it goes. That should be fun. But you knew right away when they were playing that clap game, you're like, oh shit, that's going to bite them in the ass later on in the movie right away. Definitely. But I'm looking forward to playing that. But, you know, something that's so important in a movie like this, a demonic possession movie where a family is being terrorized by all of this stuff, you have to really care about the family to be bought into the story and to want to, you know, to leave the theater or finish watching this movie and actually enjoy it. And I think they do a very effective job making you care about this family. I think the parents are somebody you can kind of empathize with. The kids are likable, and just their situation is a situation where you kind of root for them. And they're likable, and that's effective, and clearly it's very, very important, like I said, for a movie like this. It's a journey where when I first started watching the movie, I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna like this, because I think this is just gonna be one of those movies where it's like a ghost is terrorizing them, somebody comes in and maybe saves the day, you're gonna have some exorcism stuff, yada, yada, yada. But it's more of like a ghost hunting type of a movie, which I really enjoyed. Obviously, way darker, way scarier than like a Ghostbusters, but just that concept of hunting down ghosts, following Ed and Lorraine as, you know, they go from place to place, essentially like evacuating ghosts for people. That's like their main occupation. That's something I just think is cool as hell. I have a good time with that. And I enjoy following that journey of them going through that whole part of it. And really, to me, with this movie, with such a simple premise, how do they execute it so well? And obviously, James Wan deserves a ton of credit. The cinematographer deserves a ton of credit, and just the overall production. But to pull off something like this and make it so popular and so effective, you gotta give major props to the cast in this movie. In far too many movies nowadays, especially horror movies, because a lot of horror movies are made for a pretty small budget, they put a lot of the budget into the practical effects or the CGI, you know, the staging of everything, the horror, the scariness, the ambience, the main monster, the masked villain, whatever it is. They put a lot of money, a lot of times the majority of the budget into that, and not enough sometimes into the cast. This cast is great and is such a big reason why this simple premise was pulled off so well, because especially with Ed and Lorraine, you want to follow these characters. They draw you in. You sympathize with them. You want to follow their journey. You think they're interesting. You want to see what they're going to do and what more they're going to kind of get into, which we'll talk about more in just a second as well. But yeah, such a great job. I mean, Vera Farmiga as Lorraine in this movie, fantastic. Patrick Wilson as Ed, And also Ron Livingston playing Roger in this movie, the dad. Recognized him right away from Office Space, a classic comedy. Hell yeah. Love that movie, but good to see him doing some more stuff. You know, obviously this movie was 11 years ago, but still good to see him doing some things, you know what I mean? And when I watch this movie, I can't help but think about The Exorcist Believer. This is kind of, you know, me watching this is sort of on the heels of Exorcist Believer, which was from last year, but still, it just makes me appreciate this movie more. Like I said, it's a first watch through, but still, there's so many things right away that I recognize in this movie. And just while watching the movie, I'm like, man, if The Exorcist Believer could have just pulled a little bit of that and a little bit of that, a little bit of more of that vibe and some of that, that movie could have been so much more effective. You know what I mean? And this movie just does so many things that movie tried to do so much better than Exorcist Believer in so many ways. But yeah, I also like the idea of it not just being a person necessarily possessed. Yes, that's a big part of the story, but it's this property that's possessed. I like that idea, especially like the backstory of like over time, little pieces of the property had been sold off, and that had also caused some crazy stuff to happen, people killing themselves and other things like that. So it just led you to believe, okay, so clearly this property, like we learned, is all possessed. You know, this witch is gonna protect her land. And I enjoy that idea. You get that whole scene at the end of the movie with the birds kind of like circling, and it gives you this idea like there's almost this force field around this property. Like as soon as you step over the property line, darkness is gonna take over. And I just enjoy that. And I think that's terrifying and pulled off really well. I like that. I also gotta give major props to the effects team in this movie. The way they pulled off how the demons look, whether it's in kind of like an hallucination scene or a ghost scene, or it's a scene at the end of the movie with the mom. I think it's pulled off really well. It looks really creepy and it's just damn good. It's scary. So really, really enjoy that. This movie, I did enjoy. I did. I think it is very solid. It's not necessarily a movie where I'd be begging for a sequel. Obviously, they did have some. But it's not necessarily a movie for me personally. I'd be begging for a sequel, but I do find myself really wanting to follow more of Ed and Lorraine's story just because of how good of a job they do in this movie. They're just, like I mentioned earlier, their characters I think are so interesting. You want to follow their journey of being these demonologists and see what else they're going to get into, you know? So I'm definitely going to go and watch some of the sequels for sure, just because I want to see what plays out with the rest of their story and things like that. So, you know, and then I think the ending to this movie is solid. I like how at the end we kind of pan into the music box that kind of started sort of everything, you know, followed by the old pictures of the family. I like that. I think it's creepy. Kind of brings the whole like based on a true story thing full circle, and I enjoy that. Overall, though, the first Conjuring movie, very solid demonic possession movie. You know, it's 11 years old, and even movies that are popping out today in the same, you know, subgenre are not really doing near as good of a job as this movie. I just think there's so many things in this movie that are done well for just such a simple concept and a perfect example of something executed so well. A lot of times screenwriters try to come up with these like crazy elaborate ideas and just like something to say from my opinion of a guy who probably doesn't know a damn thing. But if you're a screenwriter and you're trying to write a script, sometimes not focusing on making something so crazy. Oh, I need to make the next M. Night Shyamalan twist. Oh, I need to make the next Jordan Peele twist. Sometimes that's just not that important. Sometimes it's just coming up with a simple concept that can be executed very, very well on a reasonable budget. That's sometimes the most important thing, and this movie is a good example of, you know, something so simple being executed very, very well. So anyways, everybody, thanks for watching my review of the first Conjuring movie. If you want to see more reviews of the rest of the Conjuring franchise, let me know in the comments down below. Make sure you subscribe if you enjoy horror content. Make sure you like this video as well if you enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody. My name is Matt, and I'll see you in the next one.